HOA refused my $68,500 repair bill. The next day, I locked me out of their lake houses. Before we dive into today's story, I'd like to ask one small favor. Please tell me where you're watching from today by leaving the name of your city or country in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing where everyone is tuning in from, and I truly appreciate every single one of you for being here. Now, let's get back to the story and meet the person at the center of everything that happened. The most expensive word an HOA can ever say is no to the wrong person. The smell of fresh asphalt still hung in the cold morning air when I stood at the edge of the only private road leading to 17 luxury lake houses. Steam rose from the dark pavement as the first rays of sunlight reflected across the calm water, making everything look peaceful enough to hide what had happened only 24 hours earlier. Dump trucks were rolling away one by one, their backup alarms fading into the distance, while the last construction crew packed away barricades that had kept the neighborhood from being completely cut off after the storm. My boots were still coated with dried mud from working alongside the contractors until nearly midnight. Every muscle in my back reminded me that I wasn't 25 anymore, but I didn't regret a single hour. If we hadn't acted immediately, the washed-out hillside would have swallowed the access road, leaving millions of dollars worth of waterfront property unreachable by emergency vehicles, utility crews, delivery trucks, or even the homeowners themselves. The repair bill sitting inside the waterproof folder under my arm totaled exactly $68,500. I had already checked the invoice 3 times before driving to the clubhouse that morning, not because I doubted the amount, but because I already knew someone would. My name is Ethan Walker, and my family has maintained that road for longer than most people living behind those expensive gates have been alive. My grandfather built the original gravel access lane decades before the first luxury home was ever constructed along the lake. My father upgraded it into a proper paved road after the county declined responsibility because it remained private property. When the vacation homes slowly turned into permanent residences, people simply assumed the homeowners association owned everything beyond the entrance monument. They admired the flower beds, complimented the landscaping, complained whenever a pothole appeared, and attended HOA meetings discussing neighborhood improvements without ever asking who actually owned the pavement beneath their tires. I never corrected them because ownership records speak much louder than casual assumptions, and I had never needed to prove anything. Until that storm arrived. 12 straight hours of rain pushed water underneath an aging retaining wall that finally surrendered just before dawn. Tons of soil slid downhill, taking nearly 40 feet of road with it. By 6 o'clock that morning, residents were standing outside watching the collapse in disbelief, while local deputies redirected traffic away from the damaged section. Several people immediately began asking when the HOA would fix everything. Victoria Hayes, the HOA president, stood near the broken pavement wearing expensive rain boots that somehow stayed perfectly clean despite the mud surrounding us. She looked at me and simply said, "You'll handle this, won't you?" I answered yes, because waiting for committee meetings and budget votes wasn't an option when ambulances, fire trucks, and utility crews needed immediate access. Within an hour, I had contractors on site, heavy equipment moving, engineers inspecting the slope, and concrete suppliers changing their schedules to accommodate an emergency repair. Every decision had one purpose: get that road open before another night fell. We succeeded. Less than 30 hours after the collapse, the neighborhood was accessible again. Children rode bicycles across pavement that hadn't existed the day before. Delivery vans resumed their routes. Luxury SUVs rolled toward the lake as though nothing had ever happened. Watching that quiet return to normal felt satisfying for exactly one afternoon. The following evening, I walked into the HOA board meeting carrying the paid invoice. Every receipt neatly organized, photographs documenting the damage, contractor certifications, engineering reports, and copies of the maintenance agreement I believed everyone understood. I placed the folder on the polished conference table and slid the bill toward Victoria Hayes. She glanced at the total for less than 3 seconds before pushing it back across the table with one finger, smiled as if she had just ended the discussion forever, and said 5 words that would end up costing the association far more than $68,500. "That's not our responsibility, Ethan." Victoria did not even bother opening the folder again. She leaned back in her chair, folded her hands across the polished conference table, and smiled with the kind of confidence that only comes from believing everyone else is powerless. Around her, several board members exchanged amused looks while a few homeowners quietly sipped coffee as though they were watching another routine budget discussion. I remained standing because I had not come there to argue. I had come there to deliver an invoice for work that had already protected every home in that community. The association is not paying that bill, Victoria repeated. Road maintenance has always been your responsibility. Her words were calm, almost rehearsed, and several people nodded without asking a single question. I looked around the room and realized something important. Almost nobody there actually knew why they believed that statement. They had simply heard it enough times that it had become accepted as fact. I closed the folder without saying another word because facts do not become less true simply because they are unpopular. As I walked toward the parking lot, I remembered something my father used to tell me whenever people confused confidence with ownership. He would smile, hand me another stack of old property records, and say, "Land does not remember opinions. It only remembers signatures." Growing up, I spent more weekends inside the county records office than most kids spent at baseball games. While my friends learned statistics from sports cards, I learned how deeds, easements, surveys, and maintenance agreements fit together like pieces of a puzzle. At the time, I thought my father was overly cautious. Years later, I realized he had been preparing me for moments exactly like this one. The road had never belonged to the homeowners association. My grandfather purchased the original parcel before the lake became a desirable destination. When developers eventually built luxury homes around the shoreline, they negotiated a permanent access easement across our family's land because building another road through the surrounding hills would have cost millions of dollars. The agreement allowed homeowners to use the road every day, but permission to use property and ownership of property are two very different things. Over the decades, the neighborhood expanded, new residents moved in, and leadership inside the association changed repeatedly. Every new board inherited assumptions instead of documents. Eventually, people stopped asking where the legal boundaries actually existed because the road had always been there, smooth, dependable, and quietly maintained. That reliability became invisible. Nobody notices good infrastructure until the day it fails. The morning after the meeting, I drove the entire length of the road before sunrise. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the orange glow of the sky while sprinklers clicked across expensive front lawns. Joggers waved as they passed. School buses entered the neighborhood right on schedule. Landscaping crews arrived with trailers full of equipment. Everything looked normal because the emergency repairs had worked exactly as intended. Watching life continue without interruption should have been satisfying. But instead it reminded me that every tire rolling across that pavement represented a responsibility someone had decided to ignore. I stopped beside the old steel gate near the entrance, climbed out of my truck, and brushed years of dust from a weathered metal sign mounted beside the fence line. Most people drove past it without ever slowing down. The lettering had faded, but it was still readable. It identified the roadway as private property and referenced the recorded easement filed decades earlier. I smiled because that forgotten sign had survived storms, ownership changes, elections, and neighborhood expansions without anyone paying much attention to it. Suddenly, it seemed much more important. Later that afternoon, I unlocked the filing cabinets inside my office and spread decades of paperwork across the conference table. Original deeds, survey maps, engineering drawings, easement amendments, maintenance correspondence, insurance certificates, meeting minutes from years before Victoria had even purchased her home. Every page told the same story from a different angle. None of them depended on memory, emotion, or personal interpretation. They depended on signatures, dates, and recorded obligations. I poured another cup of coffee, opened my laptop, and began building a timeline so complete that no reasonable person could mistake what had happened. If the board believed this disagreement would end with a rejected invoice, they were looking at only one page of a much larger story, and I had just begun turning the next one. The funny thing about people who underestimate paperwork is that they usually do it right before paperwork changes everything. By the following Monday, the rejected invoice had already become the least interesting document sitting on my desk. I had assembled 3 thick binders, each one organized by date, beginning with my grandfather's original purchase of the property and ending with photographs from the emergency repairs completed only days earlier. Every deed had been certified. Every survey matched the county records. Every engineering report supported the next. Instead of searching for a single dramatic piece of evidence, I focused on something much stronger: consistency. The truth becomes difficult to argue against when it has remained unchanged for more than 60 years. Before taking another step, I scheduled a meeting with my attorney, Daniel Brooks, a quiet real estate lawyer who had represented my family for nearly 2 decades. Daniel had the rare ability to read hundreds of pages of property records without showing the slightest sign of boredom. He slowly worked through each document, occasionally making notes with a yellow pencil before sliding another page into place. Nearly 2 hours passed before he finally leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Ethan," he said, "this is even cleaner than I expected." I asked him what he meant, and he tapped a faded easement agreement that had been recorded decades before Victoria Hayes had ever heard of the neighborhood. "Everyone keeps talking about ownership," he explained. "They should be talking about conditions." That single sentence caught my attention immediately. Daniel pointed to several paragraphs that had been overlooked for years because everyone assumed they no longer mattered. The easement permanently granted access across our family's road, but it also established continuing obligations connected to maintenance, cost sharing, and preservation of safe access for everyone benefiting from that easement. Those obligations had not disappeared simply because different homeowners moved into the community over the years. They traveled with the property itself. I read every line again, much more carefully than I had before. The language was formal, but the meaning was straightforward. The homeowners association could continue enjoying access because the agreement remained in force, yet the responsibilities connected to that access remained equally enforceable. Ignoring one side of the agreement while demanding the benefits of the other was never how contracts worked. Daniel looked across the conference table and asked the same question every good attorney eventually asks. "Do you want revenge, or do you want compliance?" I answered without hesitation: compliance. He nodded approvingly because the law usually rewards people seeking solutions instead of unnecessary conflict. Together we prepared a professional demand package instead of an emotional response. The invoice was attached first. Behind it came contractor certifications, engineering reports, photographs documenting the storm damage, payment confirmations proving I had already covered every expense, copies of the recorded easement, certified property surveys, and a detailed legal explanation outlining why the association remained responsible under the existing agreement. Finally, Daniel drafted a formal notice giving the board a reasonable opportunity to satisfy its contractual obligations before any additional remedies would be considered. There were no threats, dramatic language, or exaggerated accusations. Every sentence relied on facts that could be independently verified. 2 days later, the certified mail receipts confirmed that every board member had received identical copies. I expected at least one phone call requesting clarification or proposing a meeting. Instead, complete silence settled over the neighborhood. During that same week, I watched expensive sport utility vehicles roll across the freshly repaired pavement every morning. Landscaping companies crossed the road with heavy trailers. Delivery drivers followed their navigation systems without realizing they were traveling across privately owned property maintained entirely at my expense. Children waited safely for school buses on pavement that had been rebuilt only because I refused to leave the community isolated after the storm. Life continued comfortably because someone had quietly solved a crisis before it became everyone else's problem. Then Friday afternoon arrived. An electronic copy of the Homeowners Association newsletter appeared in my email inbox. Buried between announcements about a summer picnic and new landscaping guidelines was a short paragraph from the board thanking volunteers for their leadership during the recent storm recovery. My name never appeared once. Neither did the contractors. Neither did the emergency repairs. The newsletter simply implied that the association had successfully managed the situation through careful planning and responsible governance. I read the paragraph twice before closing my laptop. For the first time since the storm, I was no longer disappointed. I was certain they had received every document. They understood the agreement. They had deliberately chosen confidence over compliance, believing that because the road had always been open, it always would be. They had mistaken patience for weakness, and they still had no idea that the oldest steel gate at the entrance to the neighborhood had never belonged to them in the first place. Monday morning arrived with perfect weather, the kind that convinced everyone life had returned to normal. The lake reflected a cloudless blue sky, fishing boats drifted quietly across the water, and the steady rhythm of vehicles crossing the freshly repaired road blended into the familiar soundtrack of another ordinary week. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside my office, however, every hour that passed without a response quietly strengthened my position. The deadline listed in Daniel Brooks's formal notice was approaching, and every board member knew it. They simply believed ignoring it would somehow make it disappear. Instead of calling attorneys or requesting mediation, the board doubled down on public confidence. The next homeowners association meeting was announced as usual, complete with coffee, refreshments, and an agenda filled with landscaping proposals, architectural requests, and committee updates. Buried near the bottom was a brief line mentioning the recent emergency road repairs. Curious to see whether anyone intended to address the actual issue, I attended without saying a word. The clubhouse looked exactly as it always had: polished hardwood floors, neatly arranged chairs, and framed photographs celebrating neighborhood events from years past. Residents chatted casually before the meeting, discussing boat maintenance, summer vacations, and rising property values. Several people thanked Victoria Hayes for what they called her outstanding leadership during the storm. She accepted every compliment with an easy smile. When the meeting officially began, the board moved efficiently through routine business before finally reaching the road discussion. Victoria cleared her throat, adjusted a stack of papers, and announced that the emergency repairs had been completed successfully without creating any financial obligation for the association because, according to her interpretation, the roadway remained entirely the owner's responsibility. She never mentioned the certified legal notice. She never acknowledged the maintenance provisions. She never informed homeowners that every board member had already received documentation explaining exactly why the association shared contractual obligations connected to the easement. Instead, she presented the situation as though the matter had already been resolved. One homeowner raised his hand and politely asked whether the association had obtained a legal opinion before refusing payment. Victoria smiled confidently and replied that the board was completely comfortable with its position. Another resident asked whether the road owner planned to challenge that decision. Without even looking in my direction, she laughed softly and said, "People make legal threats all the time. Very few actually follow through." Several people chuckled. Others nodded. I simply remained seated near the back of the room, listening much more than speaking. Confidence has an interesting way of growing louder when it has never been tested. After the meeting ended, a few homeowners stopped to thank me for arranging the repairs so quickly after the storm. None of them realized I had personally paid every contractor before submitting the invoice. They assumed, just as the board wanted them to assume, that everything had been handled through normal association procedures. I smiled, wished them a pleasant evening, and drove home without correcting anyone. There would be plenty of time for facts later. The following morning, Daniel called me before 8 o'clock. "The deadline expires today," he said. "Have you heard anything?" I answered honestly. Not a single phone call. Not one electronic mail message. Not one request for additional documentation. Nothing. Daniel paused for a moment before reminding me that contracts are built around opportunities to comply. We had already provided those opportunities. We had delivered complete documentation, offered reasonable time, and avoided unnecessary confrontation. If the association continued refusing its obligations after the deadline passed, the legal landscape would change. That afternoon, I drove back to the entrance road one more time. I parked beside the old steel gate that had quietly stood there for decades while generations of homeowners passed through without giving it a second thought. I unlocked the weathered control cabinet beside the entrance and carefully inspected every component. The hinges moved smoothly. The locking mechanism worked exactly as designed. The electronic controls remained fully operational after years of regular maintenance. I closed the cabinet, secured the key in my pocket, and looked down the long stretch of pavement disappearing toward the lake. The road looked peaceful, dependable, almost invisible beneath the constant flow of traffic. Most people believed infrastructure simply existed. They rarely considered the agreements, responsibilities, and ownership that kept everything functioning day after day. As the sun settled lower across the water, my telephone remained completely silent. The deadline expired without a single response from the board. At that moment, the disagreement quietly stopped being about an unpaid invoice. It became about whether a written agreement still meant exactly what every signature on every recorded page said it meant. By Wednesday morning, the silence had become an answer all by itself. No payment had arrived. No attorney representing the homeowners association had requested another meeting. No board member had asked for clarification, additional documentation, or even another copy of the maintenance agreement. They had chosen their position, and now every passing hour simply documented that choice. Daniel Brooks called shortly after 8 o'clock and asked me one simple question. Are you still willing to give them one final opportunity? I answered yes without hesitation. My goal had never been to surprise anyone. If this situation continued, I wanted every future decision to be supported by a clear record showing that the association had been treated fairly at every stage. Before noon, Daniel prepared one final notice. It referenced the previous certified correspondence, confirmed that the payment deadline had expired, summarized the association's continuing contractual obligations under the recorded easement, and offered one last business day to resolve the outstanding balance before additional contractual remedies would be exercised. There were no dramatic phrases, no emotional accusations, and no unnecessary legal posturing. Every sentence reflected the same approach we had taken from the beginning. Facts first, documentation second, patience always. The notice was delivered electronically, by certified mail, and by overnight courier. No one could reasonably claim they had failed to receive it. That afternoon, I drove through the neighborhood one more time. Families were walking along the lakeshore. Children were riding bicycles across the pavement that had nearly disappeared after the storm. A landscaping crew pulled a trailer loaded with fresh mulch across the repaired section without slowing down. Delivery trucks continued arriving on schedule. Utility workers inspected a transformer near the entrance. Everyone relied on the road exactly as they had before the collapse because they trusted it would always be there. Infrastructure earns very little appreciation when everything works correctly. People notice it only after access disappears. I parked near the entrance and stepped out beside the old steel gate. The faded sign identifying the roadway as private property still stood quietly beside the fence line. Most residents had driven past it thousands of times without reading a single word. I traced my hand across the weathered metal and remembered helping my father repaint those letters years earlier. He told me something that seemed ordinary at the time, but now echoed through my mind with remarkable clarity. Ownership is not about reminding people every day. It is about being able to prove it on the one day that matters. Back at my office, I reviewed the complete file one last time. Every contractor had been paid in full. Every invoice matched the engineering reports. Every photograph documented the emergency repairs from beginning to end. Every property survey aligned perfectly with the county records. The easement language had been reviewed independently by legal counsel. There were no unanswered questions remaining, only unanswered letters. Later that evening, my telephone finally rang. For a brief moment, I thought the board had reconsidered. Instead, it was a homeowner I had known for several years. He thanked me again for repairing the road so quickly and casually mentioned that Victoria had assured everyone the disagreement was over because the association had refused the invoice. I politely asked whether she had explained the maintenance provisions contained within the easement agreement. There was a long pause before he admitted he had never heard anyone mention such an agreement. We spoke for another few minutes, and it became obvious that most residents knew almost nothing about the legal documents governing the road they used every single day. They had simply trusted the board's version of events. After ending the call, I realized the board had not only ignored the documentation, they had quietly relied on the assumption that nobody else would ever read it either. The final business day ended exactly as the previous deadlines had ended, with complete silence from every board member. Daniel telephoned once more before leaving his office. His voice remained calm, almost routine. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "you stop asking for voluntary compliance. Tomorrow morning, you begin exercising the rights that have existed in those recorded documents all along." I looked out my office window toward the dark outline of the trees surrounding the lake. reached into my desk drawer, and picked up the old brass key that had opened the entrance gate for years. It felt heavier than I remembered, not because the metal had changed, but because the moment my grandfather had prepared for decades earlier had finally arrived. Friday arrived with the kind of quiet sunrise that makes people believe nothing important is about to happen. A light mist floated above the lake, softening the outlines of the waterfront homes while the first birds broke the silence long before the neighborhood came alive. I pulled my truck beside the entrance gate at exactly 5:45 in the morning, long before the first commuter would leave for work. The air still carried the cool scent of damp earth left behind by the previous night's light rain, and the freshly repaired asphalt reflected the glow of the entrance lights with a smooth black finish that looked almost untouched. I stepped out carrying a small toolbox, the brass key my grandfather had once kept in his desk drawer, and a neatly folded document prepared by Daniel Brooks. There was no anger in what I was doing. There was only procedure. Every action had already been reviewed, documented, and timed according to the agreement that had governed this property for decades. Before touching the gate controls, I carefully mounted a new weatherproof notice beside the entrance where every driver would immediately see it. The lettering was large, simple, and impossible to misunderstand. It stated that access across the private roadway had been temporarily suspended because of unresolved contractual obligations connected to the recorded easement and provided Daniel's office telephone number for legal inquiries. Nothing on the notice accused anyone of wrongdoing. Nothing insulted the homeowners. It simply explained that contractual rights were being exercised after repeated written notices had gone unanswered. I unlocked the control cabinet, disabled the automatic open cycle, verified that emergency services retained their legally required access through a separate emergency override system that had already been coordinated with local authorities, and then secured the gate in its closed position. The steel latch settled into place with a quiet metallic click that sounded almost insignificant. Yet I knew that small sound marked the first time in decades that the entrance operated exactly according to the legal documents instead of neighborhood assumptions. By 6:15, the first vehicle approached. A delivery driver slowed, rolled down his window, read the notice twice, then turned around without frustration after calling the number listed on the sign. A few minutes later, another resident arrived for an early morning walk around the lake. She stepped out, read the notice carefully, and politely asked whether there had been an accident. I explained that there had been no emergency, only a contractual issue now being handled through legal counsel. She nodded thoughtfully before returning home on foot to contact the association herself. As the morning continued, more vehicles reached the entrance. Some drivers looked confused. Others looked surprised. Most had never realized the road crossed privately owned land or that legal agreements governed its use. I remained near the gate the entire time, greeting everyone respectfully and answering only factual questions. Whenever someone asked why this had happened, I handed them a printed copy of the public notice and encouraged them to speak with the Homeowners Association Board or Daniel's office. I refused to criticize Victoria Hayes or any board member because the documents already spoke clearly enough. Around 7 o'clock, the entrance became noticeably busier as commuters attempted to leave for work. Instead of shouting or creating chaos, many residents stepped out of their vehicles to read the notice together. Conversations quickly shifted from confusion to curiosity. Several homeowners admitted they had never heard about the easement agreement. Others wondered why the board had never mentioned receiving legal notices. One retired engineer quietly studied the language on the sign before looking at me and saying, "If this references a recorded easement, somebody should have taken it seriously." I simply nodded. Less than 15 minutes later, my telephone began ringing continuously. The first calls came from board members demanding immediate explanations despite having received weeks of written correspondence. Then came messages from homeowners asking for copies of the agreements. Finally, Daniel called. His voice remained calm as always. "Everything is proceeding exactly as expected," he said. "Do not argue. Do not negotiate at the gate. Direct every legal question to my office." I thanked him, slipped the telephone back into my pocket, and watched the growing line of expensive vehicles waiting quietly outside the entrance. The repaired road beyond the gate remained perfectly smooth, perfectly safe, and completely empty. For years, everyone had assumed uninterrupted access was automatic. That morning, they finally discovered the difference between enjoying a legal right and honoring the responsibilities that allowed that right to exist in the first place. By 7:30 that morning, the entrance had transformed from an ordinary neighborhood gate into the one place everyone suddenly wanted to understand. The line of vehicles stretched well beyond the stone monument at the front of the community, yet what surprised me most was not the inconvenience. It was the conversations. Homeowners who had barely spoken to one another before were now standing outside their vehicles reading the posted notice together, comparing what they knew with what they thought they knew. Several people asked to see the recorded easement, so I handed them printed copies that Daniel had prepared in advance. Nobody had to rely on rumors because the actual documents were available for anyone willing to read them. Within minutes, the mood shifted from frustration to curiosity. Why did the board never tell us about this? One homeowner asked after reading the maintenance provisions for himself. Another quietly replied, maybe they thought nobody would ever check. I did not answer either question. The documents could speak more convincingly than I ever could. At exactly 7:42, a black sport utility vehicle stopped abruptly near the entrance, and Victoria Hayes stepped out before the engine had even been turned off. She walked directly toward the gate with determined confidence, carrying a folder that looked much thinner than the binders sitting in Daniel's office. Open this gate immediately, she demanded. You cannot block access to an entire neighborhood. I remained calm and greeted her politely before asking whether she had received the certified notices delivered over the previous several weeks. Her expression changed for only a fraction of a second before she answered that the board had already made its decision. I nodded and handed her another copy of the legal notice already posted beside the entrance. The association has every opportunity to resolve this, I said. All communication is now being handled through legal counsel. She glanced at the page without reading it carefully, folded it in half, and insisted that the homeowners association controlled the community. Before I could respond, an older homeowner standing nearby quietly asked her a simple question. Does the association actually own this road? For the first time since arriving, Victoria hesitated. Instead of answering directly, she repeated that the road served the neighborhood. The homeowner looked down at the easement agreement he was holding and said, almost to himself, serving the neighborhood and owning the property are not the same thing. Several people standing nearby heard him, and the silence that followed was far louder than any argument could have been. A few minutes later, another vehicle arrived carrying two attorneys representing the homeowners association. I recognized neither of them, but Daniel had already told me to expect outside counsel eventually. They introduced themselves professionally, requested copies of the recorded documents, and spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing the easement language beside the entrance. Unlike the board, they read every page carefully. They compared survey maps with the legal descriptions, examined the maintenance provisions, reviewed the timeline of certified notices, and asked only factual questions. I answered each one briefly before directing them to Daniel for anything involving legal strategy. Eventually, one of the attorneys stepped away to make a telephone call. When he returned, his tone had changed noticeably. He walked over to Victoria and quietly spoke with her for several minutes. I could not hear every word, but I clearly heard one sentence carried across the cool morning air. We should have addressed this before today. Victoria's confident posture slowly disappeared. She looked back toward the growing group of homeowners who were now discussing the documents among themselves instead of accepting board statements without question. One resident asked whether association funds had ever been budgeted for road maintenance. Another wondered why emergency repair costs had been rejected before obtaining an independent legal opinion. Questions continued multiplying, and for the first time since the storm, they were directed at the board instead of me. My telephone vibrated again. It was Daniel. Do not change anything, he said after I described what was happening. The conversation has finally moved where it belongs. Let the documents do their job. I slipped the telephone back into my pocket and looked toward the quiet road beyond the closed gate. Nothing about the pavement had changed since the repairs were completed. The asphalt remained smooth. The retaining wall remained secure. The entrance remained orderly. The only thing that had truly shifted that morning was that assumptions had finally encountered written evidence, and written evidence was proving far more difficult to ignore than anyone on the board had ever expected. The next hour changed the direction of the entire neighborhood without anyone ever stepping inside a courtroom. The two attorneys representing the Homeowners Association requested permission to review the complete document package with Daniel Brooks before making any additional statements. Daniel agreed immediately, and within 45 minutes, all four attorneys were seated around a conference table inside the clubhouse, while several board members waited outside, unable to hear the discussion taking place behind the closed doors. I remained near the entrance road because there was nothing left for me to explain. Every answer they needed had already been delivered in certified letters, engineering reports, recorded surveys, and property records that had existed for decades. Around the neighborhood, word spread quickly that the legal review was underway. Homeowners gathered in small groups near the clubhouse, comparing copies of the easement agreement that had been handed out earlier that morning. Many admitted they had lived beside that private road for years without realizing the association possessed only a legal right to use it rather than ownership itself. Others quietly wondered why those documents had never been shared during previous annual meetings. The conversation was no longer centered on the temporary closure. It had shifted toward transparency, responsibility, and whether the board had fulfilled its duty to understand the agreements governing the community. Nearly an hour later, the clubhouse doors finally opened. Daniel stepped outside first, carrying the same organized binder he had brought that morning. Behind him came the association's attorneys, whose expressions looked very different from when they had arrived. One of them walked directly toward Victoria Hayes and spoke quietly enough to remain professional, but clearly enough that several nearby homeowners heard the most important sentence of the day. The recorded documents are enforceable, the notice requirements were satisfied, and continued refusal creates unnecessary liability for the association. No raised voices followed. No dramatic confrontation took place. The facts had already accomplished what arguments never could. Victoria attempted to respond by insisting the association could simply challenge everything in court, but her own attorneys calmly explained that litigation would almost certainly increase expenses while leaving the underlying contractual obligations unchanged. They reminded the board that multiple written opportunities to resolve the matter had already been provided before any access restrictions were implemented. One attorney even placed the certified delivery receipts on the table in front of the board members, confirming that every notice had been received exactly as required. Several homeowners standing nearby exchanged surprised looks. One resident quietly asked another, "So they knew all of this before today?" The answer came not from me or Daniel, but from the silence that settled over the board itself. Within another 30 minutes, an emergency executive session was called. The homeowners waited outside while the board met privately with legal counsel. Nobody seemed interested in discussing landscaping projects or architectural guidelines anymore. Every conversation centered on accountability. Residents wanted to know how such an important legal agreement had been overlooked, why the emergency repair invoice had been rejected without obtaining an independent legal review, and whether future decisions would receive stronger oversight. When the executive session ended, the outcome was remarkably straightforward. Acting on the recommendation of its own attorneys, the board voted to authorize immediate payment of the full $68,500 repair invoice together with documented legal expenses incurred during the collection process, all in accordance with the governing agreements and applicable obligations. The association's attorney personally handed Daniel a written commitment confirming that payment would be initiated immediately. As homeowners quietly applauded the decision, Victoria stood near the clubhouse entrance without saying a word. The confidence she had displayed only days earlier had disappeared, replaced by the unmistakable realization that assumptions had finally collided with recorded facts. Before leaving, one longtime resident approached me and extended his hand. He thanked me not only for repairing the road after the storm, but also for refusing to cut corners when the disagreement became difficult. He said something I will probably remember for the rest of my life. "You never tried to win an argument," he said. "You simply kept giving everyone another chance to do the right thing." I smiled because that had always been the plan from the beginning. The repaired road, the certified letters, the old brass key, the weathered sign beside the gate, and every page inside those thick binders had never been separate pieces of the story. They had always been parts of the same quiet truth, patiently waiting for the moment when someone finally decided to read every word before making another decision. The payment arrived the following business day, just after 9 o'clock in the morning. My bank sent a notification confirming the transfer had been completed in full, including the $68,500 repair invoice, the documented legal expenses, and the additional costs specified in the written settlement prepared by both attorneys. I looked at the screen for a few seconds before locking my phone and setting it back in my pocket. I had imagined that moment many times over the previous weeks, but instead of feeling excitement, I felt something much quieter. Relief. The dispute that had started with a washed-out road and a rejected invoice had finally reached its proper ending, not because someone had been forced into submission, but because the documents had ultimately been respected. I called Daniel Brooks first. He congratulated me in the same calm tone he had used throughout the entire process. "Now finish it the same way you started it," he said. Professionally. Less than an hour later, I drove back to the entrance where the old steel gate still stood beneath the morning sun. The temporary notice remained exactly where I had installed it, untouched except for a few fingerprints left by curious homeowners who had stopped to read it over the previous several days. I unlocked the weatherproof control cabinet, removed the notice carefully instead of tearing it down, restored the automatic operating system, and inserted the old brass key into the manual override one last time. The familiar sound of the locking mechanism releasing echoed softly across the quiet entrance. The gate rolled open with the same smooth motion it had performed thousands of times before. There was no applause. No crowd gathered to celebrate. A delivery truck entered first, followed by a utility vehicle, and then a family returning from breakfast. Life simply resumed, almost as though the interruption had never happened. Yet everyone who drove through that entrance now understood something they had not understood before. Infrastructure is built with concrete and steel, but communities are built with trust, accountability, and respect for agreements. During the following weeks, several homeowners stopped by my office just to shake my hand. Some admitted they had accepted the board's explanations without ever asking to see the governing documents themselves. Others thanked me for remaining respectful throughout the entire disagreement, instead of allowing emotions to take control. One retired teacher brought me homemade cookies and smiled as she said, "You reminded all of us that reading the fine print is not just for lawyers." We both laughed because there was more truth in that sentence than most people realized. The Homeowners Association also began making noticeable changes. Future board meetings included legal summaries whenever major property issues were discussed. Copies of important easements and governing agreements became available to every resident instead of remaining buried inside filing cabinets. Financial decisions involving shared infrastructure required documented legal review before any vote could take place. Several months later, Victoria Hayes quietly resigned from the board. No dramatic announcement accompanied her departure, and no one celebrated it. Leadership changed, elections were held, and the community moved forward with people who understood that authority carries responsibility, not unlimited discretion. One Saturday afternoon, I walked along the repaired section of road with my father. We stopped beside the retaining wall that had been rebuilt after the storm. He rested one hand against the concrete, looked down the smooth stretch of pavement leading toward the lake, and smiled. "Your grandfather would have liked this," he said. I asked whether he meant the repair itself. He slowly shook his head. "No," he answered. "He would have liked that you never forgot the difference between protecting your property and protecting your character." As we turned back toward the entrance, I noticed the old weathered sign identifying the roadway as private property. For years it had blended into the background, ignored by nearly everyone passing through. Now fresh paint covered every letter, making the words easy to read from the road. I had not repainted it for recognition. I repainted it because clarity prevents confusion, and confusion is where unnecessary conflicts begin. Every important object from those difficult weeks remained exactly where it belonged. The repaired asphalt carried families safely home. The brass key rested once again inside my desk drawer. The maintenance agreement returned to its file after proving its value when it mattered most. The steel gate stood open, not because anyone demanded it, but because every obligation connected to it had finally been honored. That experience taught me something I will never forget. Justice is rarely loud enough to shake the ground beneath your feet. More often, it arrives quietly, one document, one signature, one promise kept at a time. And sometimes the strongest victory is not closing a gate. It is opening it again, knowing everyone who passes through finally understands why it was there all along.